Once you get your starter home, what you're going to want to do is leave it in the little starter jar and add 25 grams or 25 milliliters, it's the same thing, of warm water to the dried starter. You're then going to leave it for about 10-15 minutes just to soften, and that enables the starter to be broken up a little bit more easier in your larger starter jar and gives it a kickstart to get it woken up and going again. So after your 10 or 15 minutes, you're going to want to just try to break up your starter with a spoon or a knife or something just to kind of get it going. And then you're going to go ahead and add it to your starter jar. You can see it's not quite broken up, so I'm going to do a little bit of work on that just to get it broken up. You could also put it in like a mixer or an immersion blender. It's not going to do any sort of damage. So once your starter is all mixed through, what you're going to do is add 125 milliliters or grams of water, warm water, and 125 grams of white strong flour or any other flour that you want to use for your starter. Rye flour is often used here. If you bought a kit, you would have received a white or brown flour. And if you are starting from, yourself, if you're restarting, or you have other flour in, a rye flour or wholemeal flour is a really good way to start your starter. So once you have everything in, you're going to give it a really good mix. With starters, oxygen is your friend. And you want to be sure everything is nice and mixed through with lots of oxygen in there to help the yeast. Then what I like to do is remove this rubber gasket and put the lid on it so it allows some air but means that nothing is going to get into it. Then you're going to want to set your jar somewhere nice and warm, like next to a radiator or your oven or somewhere really warm in your house. Not hot, but warm, because that will help everything get activated. Your starter has been dehydrated, and so it means that the bacteria and the yeast are quite starved. And so it may be that it takes a couple of feedings, which will translate to a couple of days, to get it going again. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and leave this starter for a couple hours, and then we'll check in on it. Here we are on day 2 of our rehydrating our dried starter. And you can see that there's lots of bubbles, lots of activity that's gone on in the last 24 hours, which means that the yeast and the bacteria are starting to wake up. So one of the really good signs that your starter is starting to wake up is this line of liquid here along the top of your starter jar. And what that is, it's a layer of alcohol that signifies that your yeast and bacteria have started to work through the sugars in the flour and created the byproduct of yeast, which is alcohol. So this means that my starter is hungry and ready to be fed again. What we're going to do now is we're going to discard some of it. So that means throw it away or use it in a recipe that calls for a discard, which I'll link to in the blog post, or you can just toss it away. It's sort of up to you. So whenever you have a starter that has that layer of alcohol in it, you just want to go ahead and give it a stir to mix everything back through. This applies if you are, rehydrating your starter or have a starter that hasn't been fed in a while. Just give it a stir and it's totally fine. You can see the gluten developing here, the sort of long strings. That's another really great sign that my starter is getting nice and active. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move 200 grams of my starter into another bowl, which is called discarding. The way that I do it is I just tend to put it on my scale and take out 200 grams of the starter. right, all I'm gonna do now is mix in my water and my flour. I always like to mix the water in first because it helps distribute the starter and all those bacteria. Using some nice lukewarm water. And then I'll add my flour and give that a stir as well. And once that's all mixed through, I'm gonna go ahead and cover it over again and put it somewhere warm, and we'll check on it in a few hours. All right, so here we are 6 hours or so after we fed the starter last. This is day 2 of the starter, and we're gonna see if it's ready. So you can see that there are some bubbles in the starter jar, and it's starting to smell a bit more fermented. There are lots of different ways that you can tell a starter is ready. For some people, that means that the starter will double in size. Now, my starter has never doubled in size. And I don't know that that's always the best indicator of whether or not a starter is ready. But if your starter is doubling in size, that's a great indicator, but it doesn't mean that if your starter isn't doubled, it's not ready, if you see what I mean. But one of the ways you can tell is by the float test, which is floating a bit of your starter in water. And what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna plunk a bit in, and you can see that the starter sinks straight to the bottom. What that means is that there's not quite enough air or fermentation in it yet, and it needs to ferment a bit longer. So we're gonna go ahead and leave it overnight and feed it again tomorrow. So I've woken up this morning and my sourdough starter smells lovely and sour. I've just given it a little bit of a float test. You'll see that it's sinking to the bottom. But I would say that it is developing really nicely. I'm gonna go ahead and discard 200 grams again and feed it 100 grams each of flour and water. And my bet is it's gonna be ready to bake in the next few hours. So it's been about 3 or 4 hours after I fed my starter on day 3. And I want to show you how you can tell the difference. So you can see here's a starter from earlier that sank to the bottom. And if I put some starter in now, you can see it floats right on the top. And although this isn't the definitive guide to whether or not your starter is ready, I would say that it's ready to bake. You can now go ahead and use your starter in a sourdough recipe, and we have lots of links and tutorials and online courses for you to follow along with, and I'll link a bunch of those in the blog post. So there's no hard or fast rule for how long it's going to take you to rehydrate your starter. My starter took about 3 days to get going, but your starter may take longer. It may take a shorter time, and that's because everyone's individual variables differ. So things like the water temperature, how many microbes are in your own house, how the starter was handled, what the flour you're using, the temperature of your house, just so many different things. So don't be discouraged if you find that it's taking you longer. It's quite often, common for things to take, especially in winter or in colder temperatures, a few days longer. So again, you're just really looking for lots of activity, a good smell, the long gluten forming in your starter, lots of bubbles. It may float, it may double, but generally speaking, the best way that you're going to be able to tell if your starter is ready is just to bake with it.